This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope you had a great week. We're finally getting some much needed rain out here in Montana. As some of you may or may not know, we are a water-stressed state. So even though we are the headwaters of the great Missouri River, the Mighty Mo as people call it, we do need a lot of moisture because it's fire season and we're already starting to experience some fires here in the state. But enough about that. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the podcast. So you make sure you're going to ring the bell so that you make sure that you get notified of upcoming broadcasts. Also, I tend to publish about once a week, so that typically comes out on a Friday or a Saturday, depending on when Franklin gets it out the door. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And love to hear from you. Ideas for shows. Perhaps you want to be interviewed. Maybe there's someone you want me to have on the podcast. Would love to have that type of information. So definitely reach out to me. I would love to reach out to them and get your comments about the show as well. All right. Well, this week I wanted to talk a little bit about a book that I recently read. Let me kind of pull it up so you can see it a little bit easier here. Let me get my slideshow here. Not going to be a lot of slides today, but this is a particular resource. As many of you know, I am very passionate about inspection. And so particularly, of course, wildlife damage inspection. And how do we identify and find sign of animals so that it can help us make sure that we're doing control over the right species? You may or may not know that I've published a book called The Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook, which is now at its third edition, and I'm working slowly on a fourth. Will be coming out, who knows how many years hence, but I continue to gather information to try to improve its breadth as well as its depth. And there comes a point, as many of you I'm sure already know within your wildlife control business, that it takes an incredible amount of energy to get that last technical piece of information. Some of you may have heard of it as the 80-20 rule. In other words, it takes perhaps 20% of your energy to consume to get 80% of the information. But then it's going to take you 80% of your time to get that last 20%. That's the difference between a professional and someone who is just sort of a hack, or just someone who is just going to be ordinary. Maybe hack is a little bit too harsh of a term there. And this is something that I think a lot of people within the wildlife control industry just don't quite understand. They may understand it intuitively, but they don't understand it practically, or perhaps in a really concrete, really know that they know it manner. And so this is a difficult thing, because many people will say, hey, I've been in business for 20 years, and you get a lot of experience, you get a lot of knowledge. The problem is that it's always going to be from your perspective. This is what training sometimes forces you to confront. It forces you to confront information packaged and organized in a different way than your own. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to revolutionize your your business. It doesn't mean it's going to put a pile of money in your pocket. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is that there comes a point in your wildlife control career that in order for you to break through and to expand your knowledge base in a fundamental way, you have got to reach outside of your own experience to learn from someone else. Now, that may occur inside of a classroom situation, that may occur through a podcast, but it can also occur through videos and through books, because these materials will force you to see information packaged in a different way. It also means that sometimes you have to reach outside of your discipline to see how other people gather information. So this is why, whenever I'm doing presentations, part of it, I should say, when I'm doing presentations and I'm reading the literature. Why am I reading the literature? Well, because I am not in the field to the same extent that many of you are going to be in the field. So I have got to read the literature to see what other people. I'm having to talk about sometimes animals that don't even occur where I've lived. So in order for me, like when I had a presentation recently on alligators, on alligator euthanasia, I've never killed an alligator. We don't have alligators where I've lived and worked. So you have to read outside. But you also have opportunities to read outside of your discipline to see if there's insights and techniques and principles that you can then incorporate into your business. Let me kind of be blunt about this. If you're going to get a competitive advantage over your competition, you have got to be doing something different than your competition. The only way you are going to be a category killer within your particular field is by doing it differently than someone else. Now, you can do that differently in a variety of ways. You can do that through being faster, but that just means you're using the same methodology as your compatriot, as your competitor, but you're just doing it faster. Think of it like a carpenter. One carpenter hits a nail a minute. Maybe you're hitting that same nail in 45 seconds. Okay, you have a competitive advantage over your competing carpenter. You can hit that nail within 45 seconds, but you're not doing anything fundamentally different. What if you're a carpenter who is not needing to hammer the nail? Now, how much faster can you work? Well, the same thing applies when it comes to wildlife control. If you were going to be taking something to a different level, you have got to be looking at things differently. Now, this is why you're listening to this podcast, I think hopefully to expand your information, because you never know when you're going to need it. So what I do is, my desire, of course, is to improve the next edition of my book, but also it's an area of intense interest of mine, and that is wildlife damage inspection. So I've started doing some reading in the area of man tracking. So I'm also a member of a search and rescue team here in central Montana. And so I figured, well, this would be helpful for me both in that particular volunteer position. But what I was kind of surprised about, though, is how much it helped me categorize the process of tracking. Although this individual is interested in tracking people, I'm not interested in tracking people. There are principles and techniques that can be helpful in understanding how to track animals. Now, in wildlife control, typically, we don't do a lot of tracking. And part of the reason for that is simply we're usually working in human impacted environments. And there's too much concrete, there's too much asphalt, the ground is often too hard to leave much of a track. So while understanding tracking is important and valuable, if push comes to shove, you would be better off learning how to identify scat in other techniques rather than learning how to track. This is why my particular book, the Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook, maybe I should pull that up here. Here it is. The Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook. I spend very little time in the book on tracking because of that problem that we have in urbanized and human impacted areas. It's just too hard to find a track. So you're looking for other evidence for animal presence. Plus, there are some wonderful books on wildlife tracks. I've mentioned Elbroch's book, for instance. Anything by Elbroch, that's Elbroch, anything by him is worth buying, in my opinion. So you want to do mammal tracking, Elbroch is your guy, and I was really pleased to see he's come out with a second edition of his mammal tracking book. It's not a complete revision, so he hasn't revised everything in his previous volume. My understanding is, and I haven't had a chance to read it, I just picked it up the other day, is that he has sort of added some new material, and so you may still want to get the first edition. And so I'll have to kind of do a podcast maybe in the future and try to do a little comparison contrast between his second edition and his first edition. My suspicion is that while the second edition substantially updates his first edition, there's still going to be value in that first edition, but I can't prove that at the moment. The point is that, as I said before, tracking in an urbanized area is very difficult because the ground is simply too hard to do that with. It's because you don't see those kinds of tracks. But, and here's the big but, right? And that is by looking at how this individual, Albert Ab Taylor, he's no longer with us, he's deceased, but this individual was sort of like the granddaddy of man tracking for the U.S. Border Patrol. And as you know, that they are responsible for tracking individuals crossing our borders, usually on foot. I mean, there's other ways that people cross our borders, or people crossing on foot. And he was instrumental in training many of his colleagues on how to track people coming across our borders illegally. But he also, of course, did things that were for search and rescue. So the principles are related. In other words, so in one situation, you're tracking someone who doesn't want to be this in another situation, you're tracking someone who hopefully does want to be found, right? Someone who's lost. So this particular book was written basically collating and coordinating all of his information on how you would learn how to man track. But interestingly enough, a lot of the principles involved in that can apply to wildlife tracking as well. And let me just sort of highlight a few things for you in this particular book because I found it very valuable. One of the chapters talks about the types of sign that people leave behind. And the way he categorized it, I found it helpful in terms of how we could look at how animals leave sign behind as well. And so it's forced me to think about, well, how do we organize the information so that when we're teaching someone about how to look for wildlife sign, is there another way of organizing that may be more helpful to people coming into the industry? Perhaps you have technicians and you want to try to improve their wildlife damage inspection skills. And one of the ways is by helping them chunk information and categorize it. It gives people more control. In other words, there's one way the reason we chunk information and why we categorize it, because it becomes easier for us to remember. If we're just forcing people to memorize a lot of isolated data, we get overwhelmed by the volume. It's sort of the difference between memorizing the words on a particular book versus memorizing the concept. By having an abstraction, we can understand a principle and then use that as a rule by which to answer questions as they begin to arise, rather than trying to memorize all the nitty-gritty details, right? This is why categorizing and chunking of information is so important. This is an area of education known as heuristics. So one of his chapters, he talks about how he categorizes different types of sign and points out whether he believes that it's conclusive of human presence or not conclusive of human presence. And he'll give different kind of weightings on this. That is not as important for us. I actually disagree with some of his comments saying this only occurs with humans and not animals. I think he's wrong in a few situations. Nevertheless, the way he categorized it, I thought these were useful because many of these concepts will work even in urbanized area where the ground is too hard to leave some tracks. And one of the things he mentioned was the word shine. Now, shine is, I didn't know what to call it. I would see how if you ever walk across grass, for instance, and I'm not talking about grass with dew on it. I'm just simply where you are walking across an area of vegetation, and you will notice that you can see the pattern of my walking based on how the sun reflects off the grass differently where I walked versus where I didn't walk. That's called shine. Well, that will occur even in urban environments, even where the areas where the ground's too hard to leave a track. I didn't know what to call it before, and I hope I pass this along to you. Thanks again to this particular manual, which is, by the way, rather fast read. It's got big text, a lot of photos, and the chapters are relatively short. So it's not a heavy read, even though it looks thicker, it looks large. It's not a heavy book, and he's got some wonderful forms in the back that you may be able to adapt for your own business in terms of how you're going to categorize situations. So that's one of the signs he refers to, and that is shine. Another sign category would be bruised vegetation, where animals, or in this case people, as he's talking about, where they're walking through an area and where branches become bent, perhaps or broken, perhaps there's scraping on vegetation. The vegetation is somehow being bruised. So that gives you another category of sign to look for that will occur even in areas that are highly human impacted. You're looking for broken branches as well. That should be pretty much obviously there. And then he talks about impression and compression. And this is where you have situations where the weight of an organism is pressing down. Like, for example, you may have a pebble that when an animal walks on it, the weight of the animal on the pebble puts an impression into the soil. Or perhaps a stick is now being impressed in the soil. Or you may see that stick that was maybe impressed, you sometimes after a rainfall where you see the soil sometimes will gather around sticks. You may see in another situation where the stick has now been dislodged from that particular location, and so now you just see the groove where the stick used to be. That's an example of a dislodged material. And then lastly, mentioning the issue of transfer. We see this all the time, of course, with raccoons, smudge marks, as the raccoon is picking up soil, often on the palms and the palms of their feet, and then they will transfer that to the downspout, or as they're climbing up a building. That's an example of transfer. Now, none of this is, I would suspect, is going to be earth-shattering for you in your particular business. That's not the point. The point is I would think that as these categories of sign can be helpful as when you're looking for information in someone's backyard, on their property, it gives you a way to tick through your head and say, all right, am I looking for shine? Am I looking for bruised vegetation? How are the skunks approaching this particular yard? Am I able to get there early enough in the morning to perhaps see tracks through dew, for instance? And if I can't see that, am I able to see where the skunk may have approached the property because of shine, for instance? But if you don't have the concept, it's going to be hard for you to look at it, because in philosophy we learn the concept meaning that the theory tells you what you can perceive. In other words, you have to have a framework, a paradigm, if you would, a grid, in order to perceive the information that you're getting. Otherwise, we're getting impacted with so much data that if we don't have a structure by which to organize that data, we just simply lose it. And that is one of the beautiful advantages of looking at things from a man tracking perspective. Now, I don't make any money on this book, okay? So I'm just simply suggesting that I'm giving you a highlight of one area that can be rather helpful for you. Let me give you one more element of this particular book. And again, I'm not suggesting that this book is going to change your career and is going to make you a ton of money. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is that sometimes when we're reading a book, there may be one chapter, there may be one idea. I was speaking to a gentleman named Alan Hewitt. He was the past owner of Wildlife Control Supplies and certainly a major figure in the founding of the wildlife control industry. And he made a comment to me one time, which I thought was rather insightful. And he said, I read a business book, and I'll pay the $20, it's probably $25 today, of course. If I can get one idea out of that book, it was worth the money. And I'm a reader, so he didn't have to convince me to read, but what I was surprised at is someone who is such a successful business person as himself, that his standard was that low. Now, I'm not saying that in a negative sense. What I'm suggesting is that he understood the power of one good idea, and for him, that was often worth the $20 or so in cash he had to pay to buy the book, but also the time it took him to read it. So, in other words, I'm not suggesting he's supporting this book, and I'm not suggesting it at all. My point is that, let's say he's reading a book, and this book here cost, what did this one cost? Oh, I think it was $15. One idea in a book of over 200 pages was worth what that would have been worth it for him. Now, I got more than one idea out of this, so that means this book's a lot. But I think that's important. It also shows how much he values and understands how important a good idea can be. And as you get more and more training within the field of wildlife control, it gets harder and harder and harder to find that one idea, because you're reading something like, well, I've already seen that. But you may say, I'm wasting my time. My answer to that is no, you're not wasting your time, because you're still getting the reinforcement of the fundamentals. And that's another element of training. So you're getting that 80% reinforced again, so it becomes second nature to you. It becomes part of you. Then you can have that energy left over to learn that last 20% that's going to take you 80% of the time. Well, let me conclude talking about this book where we talked about the role of evidence. Obviously, with him being in the Border Patrol, of course, again, he's deceased now, it would be important at situations where there would be criminal cases, and this is more than just someone crossing the border illegally, whether maybe they're looking for an escaped convict, for instance, or someone who was in custody and has now escaped, and they're looking for this individual in the evidence. Now, we normally don't encounter this sort of thing in wildlife control, to be sure, but I do think that this is an area in our industry that is a growth area, and it's something that I want to encourage everyone in the sound of my voice to start thinking about, and that is, do you have a process? How do you understand the role of evidence? Because you may be involved in some court cases down the road where people are suing maybe a competitor of yours, where you've been hired to clean up the mess that they've created, and there may be evidence necessary to be brought into the civil case. It may not be criminal, but you're still going to have some evidence that's going to hold up in court. Do you have a process and understanding of how that data and information is to be collected so that it will be accepted in a courtroom? Now, I think that's going to be a topic for a future podcast where we're going to just sort of maybe discuss that in a little more depth. Maybe I can find someone that I can do an interview with. But it's something that we need to be thinking about as an industry, because as you know, lawyers are always looking to expand their markets, and sooner or later we're going to be identified as a potential market. Certainly the pest control industry has its fair share of individuals, typically in high class cases such as termites and where there's high dollars involved. But you saw, some of you may have been encountered issues where 5-7 years ago where there was a lot of lawsuits over bed bugs, and where cities and towns actually made landlords responsible for managing bed bugs within the properties that they owned. Now, we haven't seen that kind of pressure brought to bear in terms of vertebrate or wildlife control yet, but it's possible that some of us could encounter that, particularly those of you who live on the coast, where they tend to be a little bit more aggressive on regulation than other parts of the country. So this is another aspect of where this particular book was going to be helpful in terms of framing and understanding how data and information and evidence was going to be collected and maintained, and how you can converse with it, so that this is something for us to be thinking more deeply about for our own particular business. Well, I think that's going to be enough for today. I hope that you found that a little bit helpful, if not challenging. Again, the book is called The Fundamentals of Man Tracking, the Step-by-Step Method, an Essential Primer for Search and Rescue Trackers by Albert Ab Taylor and Donald C. Cooper. Donald C. Cooper was the author, and again, this was a revised and updated edition, includes full color photographs. And it was published, or maybe I should say revised and published again in 2014. So it's not that old. But again, the concepts are relatively timeless, and I think you'll find that to be helpful if you're interested in the area of tracking. Perhaps some of you are involved in search and rescue yourself. Is it a primary book? No, but it's something that definitely will shape your perspective and understanding of how you're looking for wildlife sign. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope you find it interesting. Do drop me a line. Tell me what you think. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Do take a few moments, subscribe to the channel. Join us on Facebook if you wish. You can join us on the revolution on Facebook with our Facebook group under Pest Geek Podcast. We'd love to have you there. Share your ideas, share your triumphs, share the challenges that you have. It's a community where we share and learn from one another, and we'd be glad to have you there. Just sort of log in and try to join the group. We'll be glad to have you on board. Again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. And why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, we call it Living the Wildlife because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.